Good evening and welcome to the 9th edition of India by the Bay here in Hong Kong. Uh, while I do the introductions, William will continue to sign. When I finish the introductions and invite him up, those of you who've got your numbers, do come and sit in your seats and he'll continue to sign at the end of the session so that we can be on time. Thank you all so much for being here. As many of you know, William is the most dramatic person, so he's made a dramatic entry 35 minutes later. Give him a big round of applause for that. On behalf of Lakshmi Laroya and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome to India by the Bay at Asia Society. For the last 9 years, we've been bringing people together here, dialogue, discussion, music, theater, dance, literature, design, and fashion, and most importantly, food, to basically connect and bind us together. For those of you who think that you've come to the festival only today, put that aside. You have to buy tickets for everything else that's available, including our Words on Water, which features Vikas Swaroop, the award-winning author of the film Slumdog Millionaire that many of you have seen. John Zuberski from Australia. He's done a number of best-selling books. And of course, Aarti Prasad from the UK. So that is on Sunday. We've programmed it crack of dawn, so just after golf, just after you've eaten your first egg and woken up, you can come and make your way to Asia Society and pick up the tickets for that. Anybody interested in holistic health, remember tomorrow is our Wellness by the Bay program, and it's got one of the most incredible speakers, Dr. Ram Kumar, who is this expert Ayurvedic doctor. We had him last year, but we also had the typhoon, so he wasn't able to do the session. We brought him back this year, and I promise that'll be a wonderful session. Some of the other stuff is sold out, so I can't even invite you there, but I'm sure there'll be returns for some of the events, so do please check. Today, we are delighted to present William Dalrymple in conversation. 40 years ago, William washed up on the shores of India. Like most of Scotland, as you all know, they used to send their younger sons off to India to take over and conquer, and in most cases, bully Bengalis like us and steal all the resources that we had. Well, 40 years ago, he arrived and decided that he would give back what his ancestors did and began a whole series of books on history, looking at the Mughal Empire, looking at empire. But even apart from that, he's done some wonderful books of photography that are available. Many of the books are here, or at least some of the books are here, or 3 of the books are here. 5 of the books are here, so you can buy the series, and he'll continue to sign it at the end. William has won a slew of awards across the world. His most recent book that you have all come together to see is The Golden Road. It's breaking every record in the book. It's quite an incredible read, and we're hoping that it wins him a slew of awards. Most importantly, William and new historians like him who've been writing in a way that makes history accessible has made history sexy. Why is it important to read history? So that you don't necessarily repeat it. Sadly, most presidents and prime ministers don't read that. But we're hoping that William's book, some people will read and learn from it. Ladies and gentlemen, William Dalrymple on the Golden Road. What are they?
Well, thank you all for coming. We haven't got the thicker thing. Where is it? No, this is a knife. What am I meant to do?
That was from me to you.
Thank you, Sanjoy, for your lovely introduction. And apologies to everybody for being a little late in the Hong Kong traffic. You can blame the very, very, very good Szechuan fish dish that we had at lunchtime, which knocked both Angkor and I out. What cooking you have in this city. It's always an enormous pleasure to come here and ever increase our girths at Hong Kong's expense. Anyway, I'm speaking tonight about this book, The Golden Road. which is very much not a story about India, but about the way in which India's learning, philosophy, art, and literature diffused outwards from India from about 250 BCE to about 1200 CE, a period of about 1,000 years when Sanskrit became the language of literature and government all the way from Afghanistan to Bali, when Indian ideas of learning and a whole variety of different texts, including the Kama Sutra, spread out across Southeast Asia, enlightening people in all sorts of unlikely and unfamiliar ways. I just leave that hanging there for a second. Because India was one of those places, like China, like ancient Greece, which very early on came up with answers to the big questions that man has always asked himself. Why are we here? How do we live our lives? How do we live a moral life? What is the way to excel in this life? What should be our aims in this life? And what indeed is this world? What is the world that we are living on? What is its size? What's its relationship to the heavens and the moons? Now, we all know, those of us who have been educated in the Western system, which I presume means absolutely everyone in this room, the Greek answers to those questions, because they are absolutely part and parcel, even today, of everyone's education system. I would presume that most people in this room knew about Archimedes and his bath and the whole question of Eureka or Pythagoras and pi by their 8th or 9th birthdays. But astonishingly, the Indian equivalents are still not known. Every Indian in this room will know the names Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta, but not one single white person, I would presume, is remotely familiar with these names. These are the people that came up with the numbers that we use every day, with 0. And that's astonishing. It's very, very odd that that is the case, because it's 150 years since Macaulay was writing things like, "A shelf of a good English library is worth all the native literature of India and Arabia." We laugh at those attitudes today, yet the shadows of those attitudes continue in our education systems in the way that no one in Europe or America knows that what we call Arabic numbers were actually invented in India. And it is an odd thing that we know about Greece, that China has been very good about talking its story. The whole story of the Silk Road, which we'll be hearing more about in a minute, has been a terrific way of China putting across its position as the center of things, as the center of trade, of a non-violent trade route, around which ideas such as paper and printing and gunpowder spread out to the rest of the world. But India has been oddly incapable, for some reason, of promoting its ideas in the same way that Greece and China have either done themselves or had done by the enthusiasms of Enlightenment Europeans. And there is, in a sense, a strange confusion. I don't know how many of you know the British comedy series Goodness Gracious Me with Sanjeev Bhaskar and the uncle in that, who everything is Indian. So Leonardo da Vinci, Indian. Jesus Christ, Indian. Now there's a reason for that uncle and his WhatsApp forwards. And every Indian in the room is nodding at this point because they all have an uncle who sends those WhatsApp forwards about, did you know that the internet was invented in India in 5000 BC at the time of the raiders and so on. And the reason is that everyone in India is aware that they have this fabulous, profound, extraordinary ancient civilization. And yet everyone around them, if they're in the diaspora, living in London or New York or Seattle, doesn't know this stuff. It's not taught in schools. It's oddly absent. And while we've seen 100 exhibitions on the Silk Road over the last 20 years, including 2 at this very moment in London, the extraordinary and wonderful exhibition at the British Museum called The Silk Roads, which again posits an idea of ancient trade whose terminus is at Chang'an, Xi'an today, where silk is the primary product of East-West exchange, and where all eyes are looking at China. Now, this is an idea which is not an ancient one. The Silk Road is not something mentioned in Chinese sources or medieval European sources or classical sources. It's actually invented by a German geographer in 1877. Baron von Richthofen is building a colonial railway line from Berlin to what was then called Peking, and he comes up with this idea, the Silk Road. It first reaches the English language in 1936, when a Nazi-sympathizing Swedish explorer called Sven Hedin writes a book with that title that is a bestseller in Edwardian England. And by the time I was at college, in the early 1980s, you were beginning to get Silk Road carpet shops in Istanbul and Silk Road bars in Tashkent. And since then, China has built the whole Belt and Road on this edifice. But it's not an ancient idea, and as I will hope to show tonight, it's only one way of looking at ancient trade, and a very recent one. And it is an idea which has, like Victorian Indology, led to the marginalization of India's contribution. So tonight, that's what I want to talk about. What did India give the world? Why don't we know it? And what are the specific ideas from India which changed the world? And I'm going to talk under 3 headings, really. First of all, most importantly, Buddhism, which I think you can argue is India's most successful ancient export. Not only taking over the whole of Southeast Asia, but also becoming very popular in China, and briefly, as we will hear, the state religion under Wu Zetian, and reaching beyond Korea and Japan to Mongolia and Siberia. All the ideas of an Indian holy man living by the Ganges in the mid-5th century BCE. Again, in modern scholarship, the story of the spread of Buddhism is often told as part of the story of the Silk Road, as if it is a Chinese story, but of course it's a story which begins in India. And it's a religion which contains within it a whole set of Indian ideas of karma, of cosmology, of kalpas and yupas, which are specifically Indic ideas that come with that religion across the world, spreading with it. At the same time as that was happening, you have the whole story of the spread of Sanskrit literature and Sanskritic sciences, along with ideas of Hindu kingship into Southeast Asia. So countries such as Thailand, Cambodia, Java, the whole of Indonesia, Laos, take on these ideas of Hindu kingship, and you suddenly have a whole load of kings called Suryavarman and Mahendravarman taking on Sanskrit titles, and a renaming of the landscape, so that the king of Lord Ram's capital Ayodhya is rebuilt outside Bangkok. A new Kurukshetra appears in Laos, and so on. Then thirdly, I'm going to talk about mathematics, which is the idea from India which had the most effect on the West, though we have forgotten it today. And that story, I think, will be unfamiliar to most of us. For me, I began thinking about this when I got a WhatsApp forward, not from Sanjeev Bhaskar's uncle, but from an archaeologist friend, that this had just been discovered in an archaeological excavation 5 years ago. As you can see, it's the head of a Buddha. But everything else about it is surprising. First of all, it's obviously in marble, which is not a material you normally see Buddhas carved in. Secondly, the Buddha has sun rays coming out of the back of his head. He somehow becomes a sort of solar deity of some sort. Thirdly, the archaeologists were able to work out from close study of what they called the Buddha's tortellini curls. which I like very much. Being a foodie, that covers two of my bases in one description. That the drills used to make that were from a workshop in Alexandria, in Egypt. And in actual fact, the most remarkable thing of all about this was it turned up in a temple of the goddess Isis on the Red Sea coast of Egypt. Now, this is not a place that we imagine Indian civilization reaching. What is the Buddha doing, well, in an Isis temple at all, but particularly during the Roman period? That's not part of the history that we've all been brought up with. Yet, the excavations of which this is a part has uncovered a whole world, balanced by another excavation in Kerala at a place called Muziris, in modern Kerala, Patnam today, which has come up with the opposite port at the far end of the trading network. So we now have, in the last 10 years, brand new, a whole picture of this massive trade that took place directly between India and Roman Egypt, involving, and we've all gone back to our classical sources, to stuff that was always there, but we never quite put two and two together. Strabo talks about going to a Red Sea port and seeing 250 vessels waiting for the right winds to travel to India. Pliny, a sort of harumphy admiral, a bit like Sanjoy's father. Where's Sanjoy? I can't see him. Pliny is a naval commander from North Italy, and he complains in his wonderful geography about all the newfangled stuff that the young today are up to. It's like wearing silk, the most immoral of textiles, which he says they get from India, not from China, from India, and which, in his words, is draining the Roman exchequer of 55 million sestertii a year. India has become the drain of all the precious metals of the world. All of which makes one think again. And particularly if, as I was when I received this WhatsApp forward, I was sitting in Cambodia 5,000 miles to the east of India, and again seeing a place that is covered with Indian influence. When you go into Angkor, which today is Buddhist, but originally was the largest Hindu temple ever built, a Vishnu temple, you find stories from the Mahabharata, the Battle of Kurukshetra. You find stories from the Ramayana, the Battle of Lanka, Krishna and the Gopis. All these familiar stories written on the banks of the Ganges and the Yamuna, but sculpted 6,000 miles away on the Mekong. And reading about Indian influence in Egypt while sitting in Southeast Asia, this book came to me. A story which has been told in many diffused and separated ways, but not since I think A.L. Basham in the 1950s brought together under one spine about the diffusion of Indian ideas over this vast area, like India being like a sort of stone that you throw into the middle of a calm pond and its ripples ripple outwards over this vast area. And this idea of the Silk Road, which is such a wonderful idea, my first book was written about the Silk Road, is, I think, one of the reasons in our time that India has fallen out of the picture. Because look at this map. This is taken at random from one of the many. There are about 10 or 15 books on the Silk Road published every year, sometimes more. There are 2 exhibitions at the moment in London. And they all have versions of this map, which, as you can see, passes from the great Roman classical cities like Petra and Palmyra through the thin waste of Asia to Chang'an and Loyang, to the South China Sea. But as you can see, this map completely misses out India. In this map, it looks as if there's no cities in India at all. There's just the Himalayas and then nothing. Ditto, this new edition, which has been added in the last 10 or 15 years, which is called the Maritime Silk Road, which passes India by but doesn't stop because there's no cities or ports to stop at on this map, which is not just an omission, it's bollocks, to put no fine point in it. Compare this map, which is this idea, to the reality of Roman trade. This is out of Oxford Archaeological Department this year. It's a map of where Roman coin hoards have been found. As you can see, as you'd expect, Italy, France, Spain, southern England. The Balkans, Greece, the Middle East, the coast of the Levant, North Africa. Is this laser pointer working? Yes. The Nile, Yemen, a scattering of one or two coins in Afghanistan. Nothing in China, because there has never been more than a single discovery of Roman coins ever in China, in one emperor's tomb. But look at India and Sri Lanka. Absolutely riddled with Roman coins. And this trade route is a direct route. In the monsoon, it takes only 2.5 months to do this journey and back, and then 2.5 months to do it back again. And we have 1,000 records of direct contact between India and Rome, but not one certain, verified embassy or trading mission between Rome and India. They were vaguely aware of each other. On both sides, you have inscriptions or writings which indicates knowledge of a great power far away where trade can be done. But there is no one case you can point of a single Chinese person reaching Rome or a Roman person reaching China. There's a few strange things of a possible embassy in the reign of Antonius Pius, but it seems to be a forgery. So we have to look again at our preconceptions and rejig our picture of trade in the ancient world. Because the existing models that we have been fed are, for the classical period, extremely misleading, to put it politely. Extremely misleading. Which is not to say that the Silk Road is not a thing later. During the period of the Mongols, India has a hostile border with the Mongol Empire. No trade passes through it. And the Mongols pioneer a massive overland trade route, which Marco Polo takes in 1271. And at that period, you get an east-west direct motorway and direct transport between the two. Before that, you certainly get objects moving in small distances, capillary action along this route, and sometimes those objects, in the course of hundreds of years, will move very large distances. An example is that in the first item in the British Museum Silk Road show, there is a Buddha from Swat, which ended up in a Viking grave in Sweden. But that's not because someone from Swat went to Sweden. It passed, we presume, through various hands and ended up in a Viking trove and found its way that way to Sweden. But we have so much evidence every day now in Berenike and in Putnam of Rome and India in direct contact, and ideas passing up and down in a way that we had not previously imagined. So this is the model which I am proposing as a replacement during the classical period for this idea of the Silk Roads, which I would hold for the ancient period to be completely ahistorical. Not until the first glimmerings in the 6th century of contact between China and Byzantium do you have some contacts, and not until the Mongol period, would I argue, do you actually get a motorway of direct passage which merchants can pass up and down directly between the two. But at this period, you have a massive Indian trade to Rome in Egypt, via the Ethiopia. Then when Rome falls, India pivots. And the merchants on the east coast and the Pallava and then the Chola dynasties look to Southeast Asia. This is the period that you begin to get Buddhas and images and lingams and images of Vishnu turning up in Southeast Asia in the 5th century, in the 6th century, in the 7th century. And ultimately, ending up with the largest Hindu temple in the world being built not in India but in Cambodia in the 12th century. That's the story we're going to be talking about today. So, the first of those three headings, Buddhism. Just to gallop very quickly through this. So the Buddha is a historical character, probably mid-5th century BCE, but possibly 4th century. And that confusion and inability to say exactly what date the Buddha was is indicative of the fact that we have very, very flimsy sources for the early Buddhist period. In fact, there's almost nothing, there's no inscriptions to give us certainty and clarity until Ashoka, the Mauryan emperor, converts to Buddhism around 250 BC. And then suddenly the situation is reversed. We don't just have inscriptions, we have tens of inscriptions in the first person by this man, Ashoka, talking about why he converted to the Buddha's Dharma and his wish to spread it around the world. In Kandahar, we have an inscription which says he sent Dharma ministers, in our words, missionaries, as far as Cyrene, which is Libya in our terms today. There are echoes of Ashoka's inscriptions in Greek inscriptions in Anatolia with the word Eusebia in Greek, replacing the word Dharma in Pali or Sanskrit. Dhamma or Dharma. And Ashoka does this extraordinary job. Suddenly, in the wake of his period, we see all over India the rise of great Buddhist art and great Buddhist monuments. This is the most famous of all the early Buddhist monasteries, Ajanta. The Bodhisattva Padmapani, Padma is the lotus he's holding, and this being who has resisted taking enlightenment so that he can still help us on this earth, hovering in what one historian calls a gale of stillness, as he waits to help us here. And from immediately around this period, hundreds of rock monasteries all over the Western Ghats and the Deccan. This is one of the earliest, though least famous and least visited, outside Pune, Bhaja, with this gorgeous stupa, this apsidal hall, and then representations of the lost wooden and bamboo architecture of the time, a nice little Indian couple peering and waving out from this window here. You go inside this monastery, and here you have, amazingly, surviving teak rafters and an umbrella over the stupa from 150 BCE. Astonishing antiquity. And then further south in Sri Lanka, you have the first great success of Ashoka's mission. His son, Mahinda, converts the king of Anuradhapura. Anuradhapura, one of the great trading towns of the region, the capital of Sri Lanka, they convert to Buddhism. And Mahinda's own stupa turned up just 2 years ago on the hill of Rajagala in northern Sri Lanka with an inscription in Brahmi saying Mahinda on one of the topmost stones. This is, in a sense, the prototype stupa. We're all familiar from our holiday trips with this sort of thing in various forms in Sri Lanka or Burma or Thailand or all over the Buddhist world. This is how it starts, just a ring of stones over a cremation. And this is the excitement of studying this period. Where's my Coke? I need refueling. Hang on. They don't sponsor, but they do give you a sugar buzz, which is... Here we go. And Sri Lanka becomes the center of Buddhist missionary activity in itself. The main royal monastery of Abhayagiri on the outskirts of Anuradhapura franchises itself. So you now find an Abhayagiri monastery in Java, just outside Prambanan. So you have this whole world beginning to expand. But by the 1st century, the most remarkable thing is the trade that we've been talking about between Roman Egypt and India, and all that it brings in its wake. This is a map based on the lonely planet of the period, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, written by a Roman sailor as a guide to the ports of the Red Sea trade, particularly Western India. And as you can see, thousands of ports, details of each one put in this Lonely Planet book. not where the cheap places to stay in the backpacker places, and where Maureen and Tony Wheeler had their first hash experiences or whatever you get in the Lonely Planets, but in this case, the fact that the king of Gujarat has a rather weird taste for Roman singing boys, where you need tugs to pull you into various ports, and so on. And it isn't just, interestingly, it isn't just India and Egypt. Ethiopia is a big player in this. We forget Ethiopia in this story, but they're there. Look at this handsome Ethiopian prince arriving at a court for this Buddhist king in southern India. And these page boys bringing gifts before them with their cornrow hair, and it's a wonderfully sort of elegant figure. But what this map also shows is the geography that creates all this, particularly just the sheer scale of the Tibetan plateau. Now, I was in Kasauli 2 weeks ago in the Himalayas, and snow was beginning to fall on the snow peaks. Cold winds rake in at this time of year. Then there's a thaw in April, and warm winds begin to blow out from Tibet. And on that scale, this creates the monsoon winds, blowing outwards for 6 months, then back in again for 6 more months. And this monsoon winds, once you learn to ride them, means that you can literally move from Muziris in Kerala to Mussel Harbour, it's called here, Myas Holmus, which is where Strabo saw the fleet of 250 vessels waiting to move to India in 2 months. You then have to wait for the monsoon winds to change direction. So you've got 3 months to go and see the pyramids, go to a show in Alexandria, sell your goods, do all that sort of stuff. And then in August, you've got to be back in your port, ready to sail back. And if you get the winds right, 2.5 months and you're home. So it's very easy. A camel caravan the same distance, even if you could pass through the Persian border, which was normally closed at this period, because Rome and Byzantium are usually at war with Persia. Even if an overland route was possible, it would take 3 years or 4 years to make the same journey. And you think how much merchandise you can get inside a donkey or a camel's sack compared to what you can put inside a dhow. And this is all becoming more apparent, and the money and the economics of it is becoming apparent thanks to this recent discovery. This is the Muziris papyrus, now in Vienna. It is a shipping invoice taken out by an Alexandrian importer around 150 BCE, and it is addressed to the exporter in Kerala who's sending him all his goodies. This one container in one ship called the Hemapolon contained, I think it's 250 tons of ivory, 10,000 amphora of pepper, perfumery, cotton, silks. Each one of these is written out with the cost and with the take of the Roman customs. All three are very important. Now we have a picture of what this all looked like, because a Roman merchant engaged in this trade erected a mosaic in his house in Sicily showing what he'd made his money from. It's like, a retired businessman, the sort of Trumpian character, sort of showing off the sources of his wealth. And here they are. In the center, you've got a personification of India who's actually an Indian Yakshi. Look, she's a tree spirit holding on to a tree. See her arm? So that's one of these sort of figures that you find in Indian art at this period. A self-consciously voluptuous figure who's holding on to a tree and who is touching it. And where she touches, a bud appears. She's so fertile that the tree bursts into flower at her touch. That's the story. And here's the Roman version of it, except that this version of her is not bursting into flower so much as holding an ivory tusk, which is the main object of trade, plus exactly the silk that Pliny talks about as being immoral. And look, you can see her limbs through this is something that Pliny would be horrified by. Here they are. Look at this. This is so immoral. We shouldn't even be showing it, but here it is. And here's the other thing which Pliny dislikes. Behind her is pepper, this horrible black powder that the young are putting all over their food, according to Pliny, and which is draining Roman wealth. And he has a point, because we know from the Maziris papyrus that all these things went for ridiculous sums of money. The Indians were ripping us off in the West, right properly, adding on a ridiculous surcharge for everything. And here are the other objects which are for sale, which is malabathrum for scent, and circus animals, tigers and elephants, to appear either in the armies or in the Colosseum. We're going to apparently see a rhino in Gladiator 2 next month, so you can imagine that being added to the mosaic in slightly different circumstances. So, as a result, we see images from India like these lovely yakshes turning up in Pompeii, turning up all over the West. But the important thing about the Maziris papyrus, to return to that, is that we know the value of this container. We can write down, we can itemize it: ivory, cotton, silk, nard, malabathrum, ivory, pepper. And so vast was the value of this, so enormous to this, that if that container got to Alexandria, the importer would have been able to buy with the profits almost any estate in 2nd century Egypt, or indeed central Tuscany, with enough spare change to join the Senate. There's a wealth threshold for joining the Senate. One single successful importation of a massive container of super luxury goods could turn you into the Elon Musk, God help us, of 1st century Egypt. And clearly people were making a lot of money of this, but not just Indian traders, but the Roman state, because 1/3 of the value of all this went to Rome at the customs, which is why being the customs keeper in Berenike and Myos was some of the most coveted jobs in the Roman Empire. And economic historians, the current new book of the Oxford Book of the Roman Economy, just published, posits the idea that maybe 1/3 of the Roman imperial budget came from the customs on the Red Sea. 1/3. Other historians say that's an exaggeration, it might be 1/5. This is an ongoing debate, but it's a vast amount. It's a whole new picture which we hadn't any sense of 20 years ago. But there's also stuff going in the other direction. You have Roman Egyptian glass turning up in all places, Bagram in Afghanistan, sailing up taken to Barbaricum at the mouth of the Indus, punted up the Indus and the Kabul River, and appearing under the American Air Force Base in Bagram. And what do we have? We have Russell Crowe, we have Gladiator, we've got the Pharos Lighthouse, and we've got some nice red wine being made. And this is among many items of Roman art influencing Indian art. So we have a dialogue going on. Here is Isis and Horus. She's suckling the baby. This passes into Christian art. You have it in the Book of Kells via Coptic art as the Virgo lactans, and enters medieval European art. But it also enters Buddhist art. And here we have the image of Hariti from Peshawar. And Hariti was another yakshi, like the ones we've just seen, but she had a bad habit of eating babies until she meets the Buddha and becomes a vegetarian. After which she becomes the patron saint. You can see all the babies of children in the Buddhist world. And her image is all over this early art, but it's specifically in the form of Isis and Horus. Here we have, a little bit later, Coptic saints, and a very, very similar sort of face turning up in Gandhara in Miran, in the only example surviving of early Buddhist wall painting from the third and 4th centuries, same time as the Coptic monks are getting going. Here we have, from Miran, the Buddha and his disciples. Here from Coptic Egypt, Christ and his disciples. A different religion, same iconography. And the most important import, as far as India is concerned, is the image of the Buddha as a human being in the form of Apollo. From the 1st century, suddenly he turns up looking like Apollo. Previously, in Buddhist art, he was shown aniconically as a turban, an empty throne, a tree. Now he's a human being, and specifically, one that looks incredibly classical. These faces could be Roman senators. Compare this picture of Augustus to a bodhisattva. Previously, the Victorians thought this was the Bactrian Greeks, that the Bactrian Greeks, Alexander's lost legions, romantically stuck in Afghanistan, convert to Buddhism and produce this extraordinary art. We now know that's bullshit, because the Bactrian Greeks die out by about 150 BCE, and this doesn't begin until about 150 AD. So there's a 300-year gap. And it's not Macedonian Greek ideas which are being copied, it's contemporary Roman sculpture. So here we have all these Roman ideas passing, and as we head northwards into Afghanistan, we have these outposts of Indic culture, like Mezainak, an amazing Buddhist monastery, but one that also has chapels to Durga. In this place, it doesn't seem to have been a firm distinction between the deities of Buddhism and the deities of Hinduism. And as we head northwards to Bamyan, here is the famous niche of the Bamyan Buddha, which the Taliban appallingly blew up in 2001. But look at the whole rock face, riddled with monastic caves, as at Ajanta, as at Ellora. And we now have to ask, if there was Buddhism in Egypt in the 1st century on the Red Sea, is it a coincidence that Christian monasticism, in its desert form, monks going to caves in the desert, begins on the Red Sea in the 3rd century AD with St. Anthony of Egypt and St. Paul the Hermit. And from there, you get the Desert Fathers. The desert becomes a city in this manner. Because we also have Christians and Jews going from Egypt to Kerala. We have the St. Thomas Christians beginning at this time. So we have Buddhists coming to Egypt and inspiring this very specific form of asceticism that involves living in a desert cave, and specifically the Coptic monks were vegetarian. Seems to be a clear sign of Indian influence, in my view. I mean, more work to be done on that. Heading on into China, and the Buddha looking more Chinese as he heads into this territory. So Buddhism arrives in China initially as a foreigner's religion, brought by missionaries, by traders, by Kushan sailors coming in the ports, but also coming from Parthia and Sogdia by the 1st century. By the 4th or 5th century, a lot of influence from Indian Gupta period art, including these wonderful folds on the bodhisattvas. I love his little belly button and his pajama line here. Copied in Gansu at a much bigger scale by the 5th century. Amazingly Indian-looking deities floating over the Buddhist monasteries of Gansu and Western China. In Kizil, the monks are clearly smoking something very strong, judging by this image of the Buddha floating in a sort of fiery haze. And what the hell are these blue elephants? Anyway, we'll pass on from that. And by the 6th century, Buddhism has established itself at court, underneath the Confucians, underneath the Taoists, but there and very substantial. And the figure who changes this and makes Buddhism into a major force at court is the great Buddhist monk Xuanzang, with his fancy backpack full of scrolls and his little torch and his vajra. I could have done with that to get Cathay Pacific going last night on my flight in from Singapore, but we won't comment on that anyway. So Xuanzang is obsessed with what he sees as the corruption of the Buddhist text that he grows up with in China. He decides to go to the center of Buddhist learning in India in order to pick up the real, unexpurgated Sanskrit originals and Pali originals. And this, of course, later becomes fictionalized as Journey to the West and then Monkey Magic for another generation later on. And he gets ultimately to Nalanda, which few of us know about, but is the Library of Alexandria, is the Oxbridge, is the NASA, is the Ivy League of this period. The place that not only has a 9-story library full of every Buddhist text ever composed, all the rules, all the scriptures, all the lives of the Buddha, all the books of biographies of Buddhist monks, but also the Vedas, mathematics, astronomy, astrology. And Buddhist monks have been coming not just from China, but to Nalanda for 300 or 400 years before Xuanzang to study this. Fa Xian, for example. But no fresher arriving at Harvard or Oxford for the first time has ever been more thrilled by a university than Xuanzang arriving at Nalanda. The old help the young. Any manuscript can be borrowed, he says. There is no other place like Nalanda. And he describes this heavenly place with towers and pagodas and this library. But most interesting of all, look at the plan. It's exactly like an Oxbridge College. You've got a courtyard in the center, a cloister garth, and the scholars' rooms leading off it. That plan, it has been argued, passes on into Islam as the madrasa system, with the same courtyards, the same scholars' rooms, and then from there, through Islamic Spain, to Paris, Oxford, and Cambridge. This is where it begins. Buddhist Nalanda in the 6th century, 5th century AD. And monks are coming from all over, from Nepal, Tibet, Sri Lanka, Sumatra, and even Korea. But we have even this extraordinary copper plate found in the ruins of Nalanda, which gives the details of the foundation of a college at Nalanda specifically for the monks of Southeast Asia, and a benefaction from the king of Srivijaya, giving 100 villages to pay for this monastery to be fed and watered. So everyone is coming here from all over. This is the center of learning and literature. It's in the middle of Bihar, in the Ganges, off the Ganges, in India. When Xuanzang makes it back to Xi'an, Chang'an, he is carrying 20 years' worth of manuscripts copied out, brought on the backs of elephants given to him by one of the Indian kings, King Harsha. He loses some in a sinking of a boat on the river Indus in Attock. But he has enough left over for the Emperor Taizong to build the Wild Goose Pagoda in Xi'an that stands to this day as a repository for this extraordinary learning. And little does he realize he has an improbable ally in the bedchamber of Taizong, because Taizong has just taken on a 15-year-old concubine who is in charge of the linen and is a junior person in this setup called Wu Zetian. I think the batteries are running out of do we have any spare batteries for the control of the slides? Because it's not. Here we are. It's moving. So Wu Zetian is an extraordinary character that any of you who've seen the soap opera will know. She allegedly jumps into the bed of the crown prince just before the old man dies, seduces him. And so that when the other empresses and concubines are put into a nunnery, a year later she's brought back by Gaizong, she becomes pregnant, and she gives birth to his son. Now, all of this makes slightly more sense, not with these terrible pictures from the 18th century, but these lovely pictures from the soap opera. One can understand a bit more what's going on at this point. Here is the very lovely Wu Zetian, who can understand exactly what Gaizong was thinking. And here he is, and they have a child, and then the baby is found strangled. There's an enormous scandal, and the finger of suspicion seems to point to the chief concubine and the empress, who allegedly are jealous of the rise of Wu. And they are found guilty of witchcraft and murder. Their bones are broken and they are drowned in a vat of wine. Wu becomes the empress. And then, when Gaizong has a mysterious series of strokes, she takes charge. And then, when he dies, she becomes the only woman emperor in Chinese history. A terrible aberration as far as the Confucians are concerned, and her gravestone remains uncarved. And the historians of the Confucian hierarchy write terrible histories of her as this witch, this fox, this lizard, this snake. All these things are said about her. But she effectively comes to power by sidelining the Confucians and the Taoists and bringing in Nalanda-trained Buddhist monks. There is effectively a Buddhist coup d'etat in the heart of the court for one generation. This is rolled back subsequently. But for one generation, you have Indian-trained Mahayana monks, people with names like Siddhartha Gautama running the court astronomy, and a whole range of Indians turning up at the court, and a greater degree of Indian influence in China than will ever be repeated ever again in history. This is the high watermark. And it's an extraordinary and often forgotten moment. In the soap opera, Wu is this sort of vamp. But there is a historical point behind her. And she has this group of Nalanda-trained monks and scholars who she calls the Scholars of the Northern Gate, that sound to me a bit like the sort of sinister Tory think tank in Tufton Street that came up with Brexit. It's the same sort of group of activists who, there's a whole sort of crooked thing going on, rather like Boris's bus promising that all the money from the NHS is going to be given out to the poor and all the rest of it. The Nalanda monks come up with bogus prophecies, and Wu, who is from a relatively humble background, she's a merchant's daughter, is said to be the long prophesied Devi who's going to come and rule. She's the Maitreya incarnate in our times. The whole city to Maitreya is built outside, and a Mingtang temple is built outside Xi'an for her. Anyway, she dies and it's rolled back. But this, if you like, is the peak moment, peak India in China, for better or worse. Now, the same sort of thing is going on at the same time in the 6th century in Southeast Asia. We talked about the enormous trade between Rome and India. When that stops, there is, of course, a massive economic crisis in India. For 400 years, India has been the recipient of astonishing quantities of gold pouring very easily into the Indian laps, rather like Western money arriving in Saudi Arabia today for oil, which they have to do very little work to produce. So India just has to pick pepper vines off its vines and kill a few elephants. It's easy money at this period. And in the 5th century, with the fall of Rome, it stops dead. There's a massive economic crisis. No more gold is arriving. There's still stuff coming from Ethiopia and Persia, but it's not the same quantities that's been arriving from Rome. So, the guys who step into the breach are the extraordinary Tamil trading guilds. And these are also quite sinister forces. These guys are very Game of Thrones. They have a corps of assassins that protect each other. And if someone murders a merchant, they dispatch one of these guys who hunts down the murderer. It's all very rough stuff. But these guys pivot eastwards. And out of Nagapatnam and Mamallapuram and Tamralipti, which is roughly where Calcutta is today, you suddenly have all this expedition going to the east, looking for gold, and this area becomes Suvarnabhumi. When you go to Thailand and arrive at Suvarnabhumi airport, this is what this is a reference to. Suvarnabhumi means the lands of gold. Suvarnadvipa is the island of gold. And you have Tamils arriving with trained goldsmiths. We have their touchstones turning up in excavations. And finding new sources of gold in Sarawak, in Bujang, where I'm off to tomorrow, Palembang, Keling, and Kutai. And this gold is worked, and then more merchants come, new products are found, and the whole trading mechanism of India pivots firmly towards the east, and particularly with ships like this crossing in the same monsoon winds that allowed just 2 months between Tamaulipas in Bengal and the Mekong Delta. Suddenly, the wheels of law are turning up all over Thailand and in the new state of Dwaravarti, Sanskrit speaking or Sanskrit using state. Most remarkably of all, the Mekong Delta. Ok Ao and Angkor Borei, now in Vietnam and Cambodia respectively, face onto this great expanse of tame water, like the Venetian lagoon at the far end of the trading network. And along it run, like spokes, these Khmer canals. The Khmer canals, you follow them and you end up in Angkor Borei, and there you find the oldest Hindu temple in Southeast Asia, Ashram Maharajah. Within it, you find these extraordinary masterpieces of early Khmer sculpture. But here already we have interesting things going on. This is Lord Vishnu. He has all the discus and the conch that he's meant to have from the Shilpa Shastras, but he's wearing a sampot. He's Cambodian, and he looks Cambodian. And from this first moment in Southeast Asia, you have everyone taking what they want from the Indian buffet, if you like, the thali on offer, and rejecting, the stuff with too much spice, so they reject the caste system. They reject the patriarchy. You suddenly have women being made temple priests in Cambodia. They keep their pork. They like their dumplings. And you have weird things going on. Lord Vishnu, for it is he, because he's got a discus and a conch, portrayed with the features of the Emperor Jayavarman II, who is the emperor that founds the Angkor dynasty. This never happens in India. It would be blasphemy, but it happens here. And even his wife is depicted as Durga. You have in India, Raja Chola being crowned by Lord Shiva, but you never have Raja Chola as Lord Shiva. It's different. It's importantly different. It's not just minor variants. So here's what's going on. You have the local king, who's the local strongman, whose granddad and great-granddad has probably been ruling in this riverine port somewhere in Java or Sarawak or Cambodia. Suddenly, Indian Brahmins are all around him. They're performing an ASHK ceremony with pots pouring water over his head. And they're bringing their scripts. The Pallava Grantha script, which is the particular form of the Brahmi script developed in Kanchipuram by Tamils, specifically for use on palm leaves, hence the curvilinear form rather than the washing line of North Indian scripts where the letters hang down. If you try and draw those straight lines on palm leaves, you rip it. So a curvilinear script is designed, and this becomes the basis for Mon, Pew, Khmer, and a whole variety. All the scripts of Southeast Asia before Islam are based on this one particular form of script founded in Pallava, Kanchipuram, south of Madras. And this, it's a good deal for both sides. The local strongman is now Mullavarman or Suryavarman. He's a Sanskrit-speaking guy. He's protected by Surya. He's connected to Lord Shiva and Lord Vishnu. In return, the Brahmins get a princess, a nice estate, and a good job. And they help with the tax collecting and the administration. They're used to doing it in Tamil Nadu. Now they do it the other side of the Bay of Bengal. So everyone's a winner. But except these Brahmins are not meant to be in Southeast Asia because they're not meant to cross the Kalapani, the Black Water. India is defined from very early periods as bounded by the Indus to the west, by the Ganges to the east, and the ocean to the south. This is way to the east. So what are they doing here? So what they do is that they move the Ganges. They sculpt lingams and yonis in the riverbed, turning it into a holy river, and the river is renamed Ma Ganga in Khmer becomes Mi Kong. And you get the same thing happening. Ayodhya, the king of Lord Ram's capital, rebuilt outside Thailand. Kurukshetra, rebuilt outside Laos. All the names of all the great Shaivite shrines reappear as Khmer pyramids, temple pyramids with lingams, with Devaraja lingams on the top. So you have a new holy land opening up. The Bay of Bengal no longer separates, it unites at this kingdom. And we have all the temples turning up. Here is the Shore Temple at Mahabalipuram. It's reassembled in a slightly different form on the edge of a volcano in Java at Gedong Songo. Similar, but not identical. Look at the little Chinese features, the eaves, these very narrow doorways. This is far more Chinese than Indian. Again, in the Dieng Plateau, more Chinese features, Southeast Asian features filling into this mix. So it's not the same. And by the 9th century, the temples in Southeast Asia are bigger than the ones being built in India. So Prambanan, built in the 9th century, is bigger than anything in 9th century India. We have a 150-piece sculpture of the different episodes of the Ramayana, Lord Ram and Lakshman here, in Prambanan, 200 years before you get something similar in India. And then you get the largest Buddhist monument in the world, built at Borobudur, in a mandala, 5 stories high, the life of the Buddha at the bottom, esoteric, ever more esoteric Mahayana texts as you go up. And it's an engine to enlightenment. It's a very clever and sophisticated teaching system of Buddhism. By the time you've reached the 5th story, you've learnt the Buddhist scriptures. But it's on a vastly bigger scale than its predecessors, which are Khazaria in Bihar and Sompur Mahavihara in Bangladesh. Finally, Angkor Wat. 1120s, Suryavarman II builds the largest Hindu temple in the world in Cambodia. Even the outer moat contains an area 4 times the size of the Vatican City. It's not just the largest Hindu temple in the world, it's the largest medieval monument of any sort in the world. 1120s Angkor has 1.2 million people living in it, while London has about 20,000 at the time. So a massive occasion. And this, incidentally, don't tell Mr. Modi, is the greatest Hindu empire ever. Far bigger than the Cholas or the Guptas. A bit of this is. There are bits of this story that the Hindu right will like very much. There are bits which might make them a little bit anxious. Anyway, here, let's go on to a bit that they'll like. The mathematics. And this is, in a sense, the weirdest and most extraordinary story of all, not least because no one outside India knows this at all. Everyone in India knows it, no one outside knows it. It's one of those strange quirks. So here we have our numbers, 270. This is the first 0 in our form. So we're now going back 600 years, just to finish off. We left 1120s Cambodia. I'm now taking you in my TARDIS to 600 AD Udaygiri, near Bhopal, near Sanchi in central India. Here you have one of the great astronomical complexes of the world built at Udaygiri. Water clocks, sundials, complicated hydraulics. This originally had water rushing through here and down these walls. And it depicts Varaha emerging in the kind of Hindu Noah's Ark story, emerging from the deluge with Bhudevi, the earth goddess, from his tusks. He's got his feet on the coils of a Naga king, and behind is the guy we're concentrating on. This very gym-buffed figure here without his head is Chandragupta II, the Gupta king. Now this is the period when everything comes together. This is the period when you get Kalidasa composing Shakuntala and the Cloud Messenger. This is when the Kama Sutra is addressed to GQ man all over urban North India. All the important things come together. And particularly, this is Aryabhatta sitting in Pataliputra, comes up with the exact circumference of the Earth and the fact that the Earth is spinning on its own axis 1,000 years before Galileo and Copernicus, and the distance between the Earth and the Moon, and he puts it all down in poetry. It's a poem that he writes that you could memorize. I used the boat of my own intellect to find the buried treasure of knowledge, of true knowledge, he says. His work passes on to a guy called Brahmagupta, who's sitting in Rajasthan, of all places, on Mount Abu. Brahmagupta defines zero. He meditates on sunya, on the absence, on the void, at the center of both Buddhist and Hindu philosophy. And he realizes that zero, which is an idea which has been there in its sort of proto-form since Babylonian times, he realizes that zero is not an absence, it's a presence. It has its own properties. It's the number you get when you subtract a number from itself. And he comes up with 30 other rules like that. And once you give zero its power, it becomes the basis for place value, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. With the 9 Indian figures and zero, any number up to infinity can be expressed. This is dazzling. This is one of the great abstractions of human thought. We take it entirely for granted every day when we use it. But for the first to come up with that, to realize that it's not just negative and positive numbers with nothing in between. It is a number with its own qualities. And this is a vital discovery from this period of extraordinary mathematics, and it spreads around the world. One of the very first examples we have of zero is in Cambodia, K217 in Siem Reap, where it's just a dot. But by the time of the 8th century, it's become our polo mint shape. This instead is a rather disappointing inscription, which is the first dated inscription with this zero. It's just the number of marigolds someone has to give to the temple each year. But there and in the Bakhshali manuscript, you have this figure. How does it get to the Middle East? Well, improbably, it gets to the Middle East. Here's, first of all, is the number map that we all should be taught in school and none of us are. This is how we get our numbers. It starts off in the 1st century with Brahmi, 6 and 7, very clear. Gwalior's has the marigold inscription has 0. And then it splits in 3. The Sanskrit, Hindi, and Devanagari numbers go down in one route. East Arabic numbers, still used in Saudi Arabia and Iraq, go down this route. And our numbers, devised in Morocco and Spain, become clear by the 16th century, when they take the shape that we use them in every day. No one outside India knows this. Why is that? It's absolutely fundamental. It's actually the nearest thing the human race has to universal language. It's an incredible gift to mankind. No one knows it comes from India. We call it Arabic numbers in the West, because we got it from the Arabs. So how does it get to the Arabs? Well, improbably through a Disney character. Those of you with small children will know Jafar from Aladdin. Jafar is a real historical character. He appears in the Arabian Nights. He's the friend of Harun al-Rashid, and he's the 4th generation of hereditary vizier in Baghdad. His family, the Barmakids. Barmakid is an Arabicization of a Sanskrit word, pramukh. And they were originally the pramukhs, or bosses, of a Buddhist monastery in Balkh. They convert to Islam. They bring with them the learning of mathematics, developed specifically the Kashmiri school, where some of their members had studied, and they take it to the Middle East. When, thanks to their successful bookkeeping, the Abbasid revolution succeeds, they are put in charge of the new city of Baghdad, which they plan on a circular Indian model. The first thing they do is they send to India for the books of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta, which arrive in 776 in Baghdad, and the first attempts to try and unravel this complex Sanskrit poetry begins. The Barmakids eventually are swept away, and a generation later, a young man comes from Khiva, which today is in northern Uzbekistan. then known to Arabs and Persians as Khwarazm. This guy arriving in Baghdad is known as al-Khwarizmi, the guy from Khwarazm. And he brings together all these Sanskrit texts, mixes in a bit of Euclid, and brilliantly makes the complex Sanskrit mathematics comprehensible in very simple Arabic prose that any teenager can understand. And this book spreads around the world, and it doesn't have a very snappy title. It's called The Compendious Book of Calculating by Completion and Balancing According to Hindu Calculations. So it's given a nickname, Al-Jabr, the basis of our word algebra, while his name, Al-Khwarizmi, is the basis of our word algorithm. So this then spreads like wildfire across the Islamic world, leading to the growth of Islamic astronomy and astrology, the use of the astrolabe. Along with it comes chess, incidentally, an Indian game adapted in Persia and still with Persian nomenclature. When you talk about a rook, that's actually the same word as Shah Rukh Khan. It means a chariot. And when you say checkmate, you're speaking Persian. Shah Mat, the king is dead. And this comes through the same route as Al-Khwarizmi. And here's a map, which is much needed at this point. So here is Sind. Any Sindhis in the room? Very important contributions, all of you. You should be very proud. Okay, so Sind takes the works of Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta, and a royal embassy takes it to Baghdad, where the Burma kids have asked for it. And their first attempts to translate it are not a huge success. And then Khwarizmi comes from Khwarazm down to Iraq, translates it beautifully, and it spreads like wildfire through Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, and Spain. And on the edge of Islamic Spain at Barcelona, we have the first use of these Indian numbers in Christian Europe by the monks of Ripoll in the 9th century. But the rest of Europe still remains using, astonishingly, Latin numbers right up to the 12th century. As late as 1100, everyone in Europe is still using MCV, XVM, and all that sort of stuff. What happens next is extraordinary. Here we are at Pisa. Pisa decides to found a trading colony in Algeria, and they send a notary who takes his young son. The young son goes to school locally. He learns Arabic numbers, he learns Al-Khwarizmi, and his mind is blown. A lucky chance, because this guy is Fibonacci. And Fibonacci comes back to Italy and writes a book called the Liber Abaci, the Book of Numbers, in which he talks about the modus indorum, the Indian method, and the fact that 0 and the 9 Indian figures can allow a revolution in mathematics. Luckily, the emperor is receptive to all this, Frederick II Stupor Mundi, who's one of the most extraordinary and interesting Christian kings. He's also a bit of a show-off, and he turns up in Pisa with his elephants, his menagerie, his tigers, and his court mathematicians. And they challenge Al-Khwarizmi to a sort of countdown-style competition, open-air mathematics. Al-Khwarizmi wipes the floor because he's Al-Khwarizmi. Fibonacci wipes the floor because he's Fibonacci. And then he's invited to the beautiful Castel del Monte, which is Frederick II's perfectly geometrical hunting castle, where he meets the court astronomer, who I'm very glad to say is a Scotsman, Michael Scott, who is a figure that figures in Scottish balladry as a wizard, but he's actually just a mathematician. And Michael Scott reads the Liber Abaci, realizes it's a work of genius, but also realizes that it's just too complicated and theoretical for most people. And he says, look, pal, it's all very well, but you've got to add a wee bit more money lending, usury, interest rates, weights and measures, currency conversion, the kind of stuff ordinary folk can really make some money out of. And so Fibonacci is humble enough to actually do this. He writes a second edition dedicated to Michael Scott, and that's what creates the Italian banking revolution. It's what brings the Medici into the fore. All the money being made out of Renaissance Florence flows from the mathematical revolution brought by Fibonacci's mathematics. Not just that. The greatest mathematician in Tuscany is Piero della Francesca, who we know as this great painter of what Kenneth Clark called the greatest small painting in the world, the Flagellation in Urbino. But he's more famous at the time for his 3 treatises in mathematics that he writes about perspective. And the whole birth of perspective also comes from Fibonacci and the use of the Indian number system. Piero della Francesca's text is plagiarized by his friend Friar Luca Caroli, who takes it up to Milan and shares it with his flatmate. His flatmate is called Leonardo da Vinci. And so by this point, we've got all the main developments of Renaissance Italy sparking to life through the Indian number system, this relay race that ends in Milan with Leonardo da Vinci, but comes via Fibonacci in Algeria, via Al-Khwarizmi in Baghdad, via Brahmagupta in Rajasthan, ultimately Aryabhatta in Pataliputra. And the fingerprints of India remain on this, of Gupta India remain on this. The first attempt to translate all this stuff into English is a wonderful character called Adelard of Bath, who sits in Wells in Somerset, trying to translate all this stuff. And he does a great job. He's a very colourful character, a great translator. And then he gets stuck because the Zij, the astronomical tables, have this weird meridian, this place called Arin. And sitting in Wells in the 12th century, he writes a kind of footnote. He says, where is Arin? And Arin is Ujjain in Madhya Pradesh. So 600 years after these original mathematical observations are made in Ujjain in Madhya Pradesh, an Englishman is puzzling over them in Wells. But rather less promisingly, you could also argue that it's the mathematical advances of India that allows the corporations of the West to develop, including the East India Company. And in many ways, the East India Company takes Indian weapons and uses them back against Indians, subjecting India in the 18th century. But the East India Company is another story for another day, and that is all for what's done. So thank you very much, Sanjoy. Thank you.
So what we'll do is we'll take a couple of questions. I know we're running late, but if we can take clusters of questions, so anybody with questions on this side of the room, and we'll take 2 or 3 and ask William. You don't have to ask questions. You can just get the book signed.
A glass of wine still.
Or any questions on the other side? Fantastic. So why don't we just give him another round of wonderful applause.
Yeah. And a glass of wine. Thank you very much.
And those of you who haven't bought your books, you can buy your books here. William will be happy to sign. Those of you who've got your numbers, please come and line up. And just to remind you, if you've enjoyed this conversation, please do come for Words on Water, which is on Sunday. 3 amazing of our friends, in fact, Vikas Swaroop, John Zubereski, and Aarti Prasad, in association with the Hong Kong Literature Festival. And do remember, that's in March. March dates, Hong Kong Literature Festival, do book. And if you've enjoyed this conversation and want to get much more information, come to the festival that we set up 18 years ago, the Jaipur Literature Festival. Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple are co-festival directors, and we set that up. It is amongst the largest festivals in the world today. 500,000 people on the ground, 25 million people online. So thank you all. Come back for the rest of the festival. Thank you, William Dalrymple, and a small token of our appreciation for you. A pashmina from Kashmir. Parul. Willie's But you can get it when you sign, while you
You're
sign.
going to steal it, Sanjoy.
We're going to actually begin with number 28. I know there was a long line of people, and we did give out numbers.
back,
So just to keep to that, somebody has a number 28, and we'll begin with that for the signing, please.
Okay.
That's you.
So, any questions? Are we going to do questions? No, we're not doing questions. Oh, I see. Sorry.
You float them. There was a who's and ours. No questions.
Okay. Too strict, okay.
Oh, you do have a question. Go ahead. Can we get a mic there?
I'm just curious.
Hello.
Hi.
Well done. I'm glad you didn't get shut up by Sanjoy. He always does this to me too.
No, I'm just curious. I understand from one of your interviews online that you have a lot of family and relatives going back working in India. So my question is, to what extent has that impacted your entire research and work on all of the in India, basically?
Well, what was odd about it is I didn't know any of this when I turned up in India. It wasn't one of those houses that had sort of elephant leg in the front hall full of sort of bamboo canes from Burma or anything. There was nothing Indian at all in my childhood, and I knew that my dad had been out in partition, but I didn't know any more than that. And anyway, it turned out that I have both Bengali blood from Chandanagar, French Bengali blood, and Mughal blood from another relative, and 10 generations born in India before that. But I knew none of this. It's interested me now I'm writing about it, but it wasn't why I went there.
And Olive's family as well.
And my wife's family even more so, yeah. The Scots were the biggest imperialists of all. We love to think of ourselves as Mel Gibson, freedom and all that, but we were the ones that came up with Jardine Matheson, I'm afraid. And
There was a question at the back. Yeah. Can we get a mic there?
I like this queuing and questioning at the same time. This is very productive.
Sorry, I feel like I've jumped the queue. Just first of all, I just want to say thank you for your books. They made a big difference when I was going through
Thank
a very
you.
difficult period. So
Thank
they
you.
were wonderful escapism. Don't know if escapism is the right word, but I've gone with it now. I'm just curious. I teach grade 7 history classes, grade 8 history classes, and we're looking at the Opium Wars. So at the minute, I've spent a lot of time going across to mainland China, Guangzhou and Dongguan, and that area of China there. And I was surprised to the extent of the East India Company. I was aware of what happened between Britain and India, but not so much India and Canton. Is that a subject you'd ever be interested in pursuing and researching further?
It's not only a subject I'm interested in, it's a subject I'm seriously considering writing about next.
Please do.
And we've found a whole crate of family letters, I'm afraid, which literally guilty as charged. Not my Dalrymple side of my family, but a great-grandfather who was a very humble origin and who went out here and came back mysteriously with a great fortune. He's literally an opium crate full of opium letters. That may well be the next project. But this is a world I know little about up to now, and it doesn't appear in any of my 4 company books except fleetingly. So it's something I think needs to be written. It may end up being a company quintet rather than a quartet, I'm afraid. Thank you.
There was a question, the lady at the back.
Sorry, thank you for your work. I'm very, very fascinated by the development of mathematics and calendars and all of these circularity of time. Of course, it didn't just happen in India, it happened everywhere around the world. And one calendar and the number system that really piques my interest is the Mayan calendar and number system. Do you see any similarities? Because this one is based on 10, one, and the other one is based on 20.
So there's a lot of writing about this and a lot of contestation. There's a wonderful book which will answer your question at length, which I recommend, called Finding Zero, by a guy called, I think, Andrea Anzil. Anyway, he's in the bibliography of the book, if you could look him up. And he's an Israeli mathematician who set out to answer exactly this question. And he comes up with the little dotted stela that I showed from Cambodia, K127. He decides at the end of a whole book that this is the original 0, and so he doesn't go for the Maya the Mayan theory, so I have left that out, but I followed him on that. Most people, I think, would say that Brahmagupta is the guy that defines it, but you have versions of zero going back to Babylon as a placeholder. Some unweaponized yeah. And this lady in front of you here.
Hi, thank you so much.
Hello.
I'm an economist, and I'm sorry to say, but I have a question. In your podcast,
please don't be sorry to be an economist at all.
You had a guest asked, what would Jinnah think of Pakistan today? And obviously, you think about the world broadly and widely through time. I would like to hear what you think about India today. And what would
Jinnah have thought about India? Or?
And then also Gandhi or yourself, and where is it going, right? I'm curious. Thank you.
So, how to begin answering that question? I mean, I've written about India for 40 years, so I've got a great swathe of things that you could look at. But in short, I'm not a particular fan of the current government, but India is a democracy, and we saw in the last election democracy at work as the ruling party's majority was decreased. And in a democracy, as we've seen in America this week, we don't always like the results of elections, but we have to respect the results of elections. And I think what's happening in India is similar to what's happening in America, that we're having a populist government, in many ways a reaction to 30 or 40 years of left-leaning politics. It's not particularly to my personal taste, but many Indians revere and are pleased with what's happening. What I would say is that while I'm worried about India's political direction in many ways, I am very, very optimistic about India's economic direction. And I think the last time I was in Hong Kong was at a conference. Everyone was saying that the money was leaving these shores and flowing towards Vietnam and towards India. And I think there's no question. I have very, very few economists, tell me if I'm wrong, you're an economist, I'm not, but very few economists would doubt the fact that by the end of the century, the most probable top 3 economies in the world are likely to be America, China, and India. The order of those 3 remains to be seen. If we'd all been putting bets on it 10 years ago, we'd have said China. We wouldn't necessarily put the same bet on now. I think it's up for grabs. Everyone's been predicting the decline of America for 30 years now, and it never quite seems to happen. But India seems to me as a country which has got incredible economic potential, and just living there. I mean, I live in 2 places. I spend the summer in London, and I spend the winter in India. And in London, every year I seem to wait longer for a reply from the doctor. There seems to be more potholes and longer queues on the motorways, and everything seems to be slightly cracking apart. In India, the opposite is true. It used to take 9 hours to drive to Jaipur, then it took 5, and now it takes 3. The airports are growing and better. The internet on my farm is double the speed it was, or triple the speed it was 5 years ago. You could just feel in your everyday life things improving. There are many, many things which you can complain at. The disparity of wealth, it seems to be getting greater. The gap between rich and poor seems to be getting greater. There are many other reasons for concern. But while the political future of India is something that some people do worry about, the economic rise of India seems to me, like that of China, to be very, very firm. And I think one of the things that studying history does is it emphasizes that some people in the West look on the rise of India and China as something weird and strange and improbable and needing explanation. History, deep history, the longue durée, shows that for most of human history, the areas that are now India and China were the most productive on earth, producing between them 70% of the world's economy for most of human history. And that the aberration is the colonial period. Clive in India, the Opium Wars here, imposed by force of gunboats, changed the natural trading order of the world for 200 or 300 years. That meridian began to rebalance in 1947, and 75 years later, we find the world returning, in a sense, to its natural position, with India and China at the top of the pecking order. That, I think, is something that history does show. But you're the economist and I'm not. So thank you. Well said. Before we get any more political questions.
Thank you all so much. Thank you.